Imagine the history of humanity as a 24-hour clock. That's it. Everything we have ever done compressed into a single day. Agriculture, the thing that allowed us to stop wandering and start planting, doesn't appear until 11:56 p.m. The first cities, writing, the pyramids, all of that appears at 11:57. Jesus is born at 11:59. The Industrial Revolution happens in the final second, and everything you know, smartphones, the internet, space travel, all of it exists in a fraction of the last second. So what is there before 11:56? What fills the other 23 hours and 56 minutes of our history? It isn't prehistory. It isn't a prequel. It is the true story. And we have forgotten almost all of it. Here is what nobody tells you in school. Modern humans, people anatomically identical to you and me, have been around for at least 300,000 years, probably longer. For the vast majority of that time, about 290,000 years, we lived without farms, without cities, without kings, priests, or written law. We lived in small groups, moving to the rhythm of the seasons, reading the landscape like a language, surviving ice ages, droughts, and predators that could tear us apart. And we didn't just survive. We lived, fell in love, raised children, created art, developed complex belief systems, built relationships and communities that lasted for generations. We were fully human, with brains just as large and complex as ours, feeling joy, grief, and wonder under the exact same stars we see today. But when we talk about history, we usually mean the history of civilization. We think of Mesopotamia and Egypt, Rome and Greece, of dynasties, empires, and wars. We act as if everything before agriculture was just a waiting period, as if our ancestors sat around for 100,000 years hoping someone would invent bread. That isn't what happened. Those thousands of years were packed with human experience. Tens of thousands of generations lived entire lives. They solved problems we can't even imagine. They developed technologies that kept them alive in environments that would kill most of us in days. They created songs and stories that explained the world. They laughed. They cried. They asked themselves the same questions we still ask. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens when we die? The problem is, they didn't write anything down. There are no history books from 50,000 years ago. No diaries, no letters, no tax records. Everything we know about them comes from fragments, stone tools, cave paintings, bones, genetic codes, archaeological sites where we can look at the scattered remains of a meal from 40,000 years ago and try to imagine what they were talking about while they ate. It's like trying to understand your entire family history from 3 photographs and a handful of tools that belong to your great-great-grandfather. Is it boring? Far from it. If you're watching this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these videos. And maybe leave a comment to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love reading them. Tokyo at sunrise, Miami at midnight. It is wild that we are all here together across time zones to think about deep time, because that is what we are doing tonight. We are traveling into deep time, past the pyramids, past the first farmers, past the last ice age, right down to the moment when humans became truly human. Not physically, we had been anatomically modern for a while, but cognitively. That moment, somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, when something clicked in our brains, and we became capable of things no species had ever achieved. We are going to walk with our ancestors through landscapes that no longer exist. We will see how they hunted woolly mammoths in frozen tundras and gathered shells on coastlines now swallowed under dozens of feet of water. We will explore the caves where they painted masterpieces by firelight 40,000 years ago. We will try to understand their spiritual lives, their technology, their social worlds, the way they perceived reality itself. And here is what makes this journey so strange and so beautiful. These people, your ancestors from 2,000 generations ago, had the exact same capacity for thought as you. The exact same emotions. If you could somehow take a baby from 50,000 years ago and raise them in the modern world, they would be completely normal. They could learn calculus, play the violin, become a software engineer. The only difference between them and us is time and accumulated knowledge. They didn't know less because they were stupid. They knew less because they got here first. And in some ways, they knew infinitely more than we do. About survival, about reading nature, about how to live in balance with a world that could kill you with a single bad decision. So let's go back. Let's go back before civilization, before history begins the way we usually think of it, to those tens of thousands of years when humans were fully human, but lived in a world we can barely wrap our minds around. Back to where our true story begins. Something changed in the human mind between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. Not in our bodies. Those had been evolving for millions of years. Not in the size of our brain, which had already reached modern proportions. No, it was something different, invisible. Something that would transform a species of clever ape into the most dominant force on the planet. Scientists call it the cognitive revolution, but that name makes it sound like a single event. A moment when someone's brain suddenly switched on and everything changed. The reality was messier, stranger, and far more interesting. Imagine your ancestors roughly 90,000 years ago. Anatomically, they looked almost exactly like you. Same skull shape, same body proportions, same brain size. If you dressed one in modern clothes and put them on the subway, you probably wouldn't notice them. But if you tried to have a conversation, you would immediately realize that something was fundamentally different. The question that haunts archaeologists is simple and terrifying. What was going on inside those anatomically modern skulls before the revolution? They had the hardware, the biological equipment for complex thought. But did they have the software? Were they conscious in the same way we are? Could they imagine futures that didn't exist, create meanings that had no connection to immediate survival? We don't know. We can't know. Consciousness doesn't fossilize. But we have clues, and those clues suggest that at some point during this window, something unprecedented happened inside the human mind. The first signs appear about 100,000 years ago in a cave called Blombos on the southern tip of South Africa. Archaeologists found pieces of ochre, a red mineral that humans had been using for hundreds of thousands of years, probably for practical things like tanning hides or sun protection. But these pieces were different. Someone had carved geometric patterns into them, crisscrossing lines carefully executed, forming abstract designs that served absolutely no practical purpose. Think about what that means. Someone looked at a piece of red rock and decided it wasn't enough for it to just be a rock. It had to mean something, represent something. It had to be beautiful or significant, marked in a way that only mattered inside the human mind. That is symbolic thought. the ability to create and manipulate meanings that exist purely in the mental realm. And it is the foundation of everything that makes humans unique. Language, art, math, religion, law, money, nations. All of it depends on our ability to create shared fictions that everyone accepts as real. But one cave doesn't make a revolution. Blombos could have been a fluke, a lone genius experimenting with ideas that went nowhere. What makes the cognitive revolution revolutionary is that this kind of behavior starts showing up everywhere across Africa and eventually beyond. Shell beads from sites in Morocco and Algeria dated to 82,000 years ago. Not just shells, but shells that were carefully selected, pierced, and worn as ornaments. Someone cared about how they looked. Someone wanted to display symbols of identity status or group belonging. Sophisticated bone tools that go beyond simple function to show craftsmanship, design, and aesthetic choice. Evidence of long-distance trade networks, materials moving hundreds of miles from their source, implying not just exchange, but social relationships, trust, reciprocity, obligations that existed across space and time. And everywhere, ochre. More ochre than any practical purpose could justify. Our ancestors were obsessed with it, mining it, processing it, using it in ways we still don't fully understand. Probably for body paint, maybe for rituals, definitely for something they cared deeply about beyond mere survival. So what happened? What triggered this shift in the human mind? One theory suggests it was language. Not the simple communication early humans had, probably warning calls and basic coordination, but a complex grammatical language capable of expressing abstract concepts, hypothetical situations, past events, and future possibilities. Language changes everything. With language, you don't just survive the world, you explain it. You create stories about why things happen, where you came from, what happens after death. You can teach complex skills without demonstration, pass knowledge from one generation to the next without personal contact. You can lie, speculate, imagine alternatives to reality. Most importantly, you can cooperate in ways no other species can match. You can create shared myths about ancestors, gods, or tribal identities that bind thousands of strangers into functional societies. You can convince people to follow rules, make sacrifices, and work toward collective goals that none of them benefit from individually. But language doesn't show up in the fossil record. Voices don't preserve. So we are left to infer its development from the effects it would have produced. Another theory points to genetics. Maybe there was a mutation, a tiny change in brain wiring that unlocked new cognitive abilities. There is fascinating evidence for this. A gene called FOXP2, crucial for language ability, shows signs of recent selection in modern humans. Changes in brain development genes might have altered how neural networks formed, creating new capacities for abstract reasoning. But genetic changes happen slowly, gradually within populations. They don't flip like a switch. And the archaeological evidence suggests the cognitive revolution happened relatively fast, within a few tens of thousands of years. That is quick for evolution. So maybe there wasn't a single cause. Maybe it was a chain reaction. A small genetic shift creates a slightly better capacity for language. That allows for slightly more complex social organization. That creates a selection pressure for even better communication skills. That enables a more sophisticated culture, which alters the selective environment. On and on, genes and culture co-evolving, driving each other forward in an accelerating feedback loop. And somewhere in that process, humans crossed a threshold. We became capable of imagination. Imagination is the true superpower. It is what lets you think about things that aren't real yet, that might never be real, that exist only as possibilities in your mind. A lion can't imagine hunting strategies it has never tried. A chimpanzee can't design tools it has never seen. But humans can. We can close our eyes and run simulations of alternate realities, testing ideas in mental space before committing to them in the physical world. With imagination comes storytelling. And telling stories might be the most powerful technology humans ever invented, more important than fire, stone tools, or agriculture. Stories let you transmit complex information efficiently. Instead of explaining every detail of how to track prey through the savanna grass, you tell the story of the great hunter who succeeded or failed. The emotional content makes it memorable. The narrative structure makes it understandable. The social context of the telling strengthens group bonds and shared knowledge. Stories also let you create social technologies. Laws are stories about right and wrong. Religions are stories about cosmic meaning. National identities are stories about a shared history and destiny. Money is a story we tell about value. None of these things exist in physical reality. They are pure fiction, but they govern our lives just as surely as gravity. And our ancestors, those anatomically modern humans living between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, were figuring all of this out. Probably not consciously, without understanding what they were creating. But generation after generation, their mental toolkit expanded. Their ability to think symbolically and communicate abstractly improved. Their capacity for cooperation through shared fictions grew. They were becoming human. Not in body, that had already happened, but in mind, in consciousness, in that strange ability to live simultaneously in the real world and in imaginary worlds of meaning, symbols, and history. And they weren't alone. Neanderthals were doing something similar in Europe. Evidence suggests they created art, buried their dead with rituals, and perhaps even had language. The Denisovans, who we know less about, were probably cognitively sophisticated too. The capacity for symbolic thought might have been emerging across multiple human species, all descending from that bottleneck population, all carrying the genetic potential for imagination. But only one species would push it to its ultimate conclusion. Only Homo sapiens would become so deeply dependent on shared fictions that we would eventually reshape the entire planet according to ideas that existed nowhere else but in our collective imagination. That story, however, was just beginning. For now, your cognitively modern ancestors were still just one human species among others, living in small groups across Africa, testing their new mental abilities, learning to think in ways that would have seemed like magic to any other animal on Earth. The question wasn't whether they could imagine new worlds. The question was what they were going to do with that power. Then came the moment that would define our species forever. About 60,000 years ago, a small group of humans stood on the shores of northeastern Africa, looking across the strait toward the Arabian Peninsula. They weren't the first to attempt this journey. Earlier groups had left Africa, spreading into the Middle East and beyond. But most of those populations had died out or been absorbed. This time would be different. These weren't random wanderers. These were people carrying all the genetic and cultural innovations honed over hundreds of thousands of years. They had sophisticated language, complex social structures, advanced tool-making techniques, and above all, the kind of adaptability that only comes from ancestors who survived the impossible. When they crossed that narrow barrier of water, maybe barely 12 miles across at its narrowest point, they began the greatest journey in human history. No one knows exactly why they left. Maybe population pressure in Africa had grown too intense. Maybe a particularly good season made the Arabian side look promising. Maybe they were simply curious, driven by that uniquely human need to see what lies just over the horizon. Whatever the reason, they left, and they kept going. Genetic evidence tells us this wasn't a single massive migration. It was more like a slow leak that never stopped. Small bands splitting off, moving into new territories, settling there, and then sending out their own splinter groups, generation after generation. Each move wasn't huge, maybe just 20 miles, the distance a group could walk in a few days. But those small moves added up. In just a few thousand years, humans had spread from Africa all the way to Australia. Think about that. In less than 5,000 years, small groups of people, walking with everything they owned on their backs, had colonized a quarter of the planet. The routes they took are still debated. The traditional theory suggests they followed the coasts, hugging the shores of the Arabian Peninsula, and then moving along the Indian coast toward Southeast Asia. It makes sense. Coastal environments are rich in resources. Shellfish, fish, seabirds, all relatively easy to harvest with simple technology. Follow the coast, and you always know where the water is. You can't get lost. The ocean is your map. Recent archaeological evidence supports this coastal route. Sites along the southern coast of Arabia show human occupation dating back 55,000 years or more. Shell middens, the ancient garbage dumps of seafood meals, appear along the migration paths from Africa to Australia. The stone tools found at these sites show a clear African ancestry, the technological fingerprints of people who learned their craft on another continent. But the coastal route wasn't the only way. Other groups moved inland, following river systems and game trails through the interior of Arabia. During certain periods, when the climate was wetter, what is now a brutal desert would have been a grassland, dotted with lakes and rivers. Archaeological sites inside Arabia show human presence during these green windows, proving that people exploited temporary environmental openings to push deep into territories that would later become uninhabitable. Both routes presented challenges that would have broken less adaptable species. The coast meant learning entirely new food sources. These Africans had never seen a mangrove swamp, never harvested an oyster, never built boats capable of crossing even small stretches of open water. They had to figure it out as they went, teaching their children skills they themselves had invented just a few years prior. The inland route was even more brutal. Water sources could be hundreds of miles apart. The plants and animals were unfamiliar, potentially dangerous. One wrong turn, one miscalculation about where the next spring was, and entire groups could die of thirst. The fact that they succeeded tells us a lot about their planning capabilities and geographical knowledge. And they didn't just survive, they thrived enough to keep expanding. Patterns of genetic diversity show that these migrating populations weren't desperate refugees fleeing a disaster. They were healthy breeding populations, capable of splitting into new groups every few generations. Each split sent pioneers into unknown territory, while the parent group stayed behind, maintaining its established range and resources. By 50,000 years ago, humans had reached Southeast Asia. We know this from sites like Tam Pa Ling Cave in Laos, where human remains dating back 46,000 years show African ancestry. These people had walked thousands of miles from their ancestral homeland, crossing multiple climate zones, learning to exploit dozens of new food sources, all while holding on to enough of their original culture that we can recognize them as descendants of African populations. But the most remarkable journey was still to come. Somewhere in Southeast Asia, a group of humans looked across the ocean toward a landmass they might have glimpsed on a clear day: Australia. Getting there would require a level of maritime sophistication that seems almost impossible for Stone Age people. Even when sea levels were at their lowest during the Ice Ages, the distance between Indonesia and Australia was never less than 50 miles of open ocean. There is no way to walk it, no islands to hop across. You have to build boats capable of carrying people, supplies, and enough water to survive days at sea. You have to navigate out of sight of land. You have to be absolutely certain you will hit the other side, because there is no turning back once you commit. Yet they did it. Archaeological evidence now shows that humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The Majed Bebe shelter in northern Australia contains artifacts dating back 65,000 years, including sophisticated stone tools, ground ochre for art, and evidence of the systematic hunting of large marsupials. That means humans crossed into Australia almost immediately after leaving Africa. In the span of just 5,000 years, they had mastered maritime technology sophisticated enough for major ocean voyages. Think about what that involved. They had to understand boat building, likely using bamboo or wooden frames covered with bark or animal skins. They needed navigation skills, the ability to read stars, currents, and weather patterns. They needed planning capacity, sophisticated enough to provision a journey that could take weeks. And they needed courage, the willingness to sail toward a horizon where they couldn't be certain anything existed at all. The people who made that first crossing must have been remarkable, but they weren't superhumans. They were normal people, using the exact same basic cognitive toolkit that all humans share. The fact that they succeeded tells us something important about human potential. Give people a challenge, and they will develop the skills to overcome it. If the technology doesn't exist yet, they will invent it. If the knowledge isn't available, they will discover it through trial and error. That is what it means to be human. Once in Australia, these pioneers faced another massive adaptation, the Australian megafauna. Giant kangaroos, massive wombats, predatory birds large enough to kill humans. These were unlike anything in Africa or Asia. The plants were different. The seasons followed unfamiliar patterns. The entire ecology was alien. Yet within a few thousand years, they had not only adapted, but spread across the entire continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from the coastal regions to the harsh interior deserts. Meanwhile, back in Asia, other groups were pushing north and west. By 45,000 years ago, humans had reached Europe, stepping into a landscape already occupied by Neanderthals, who had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. That encounter would prove highly consequential, but that is another part of the story. The remarkable thing about this entire expansion is how consistent the pattern was. small groups moving into new territory, adapting to local conditions, expanding until they hit carrying capacity, and then splitting to send pioneers even further. It was this exact same pattern that carried humans from the Red Sea to the Pacific in a few thousand years. The same pattern that would eventually bring humans into every habitable environment on Earth, except for the isolated islands that required more sophisticated navigation than Stone Age people possessed. Genetic studies of modern populations allow us to trace these ancient journeys with incredible precision. Indigenous Australians carry genetic markers that diverge from African populations around 60,000 years ago, perfectly matching the archaeological timeline. Native Americans carry markers showing their ancestors split from East Asian populations about 25,000 years ago, then crossed into the Americas during the last Ice Age. Pacific Islanders carry the genetic signatures of multiple waves of migration, each pushing a little further into the unknown ocean. Each of these migrations demanded the same fundamental human capacities: the ability to learn and adapt quickly, the capacity to cooperate in groups large enough to survive, but small enough to move efficiently, the creativity to develop new technologies when the old ones proved inadequate, and the courage to keep walking into unknown territories when it would have been safer to stay in familiar places. The people making these journeys weren't thinking about conquering continents or making history. They were just living their lives, moving to new hunting grounds when the old ones got too crowded, following animal migrations, exploring that interesting valley they could see in the distance. But those small decisions, repeated over thousands of generations, resulted in the most complete biological invasion in the history of the planet. Within 50,000 years of leaving Africa, humans had reached almost every habitable environment on Earth. We had adapted to tropical rainforests and Arctic tundras, high mountain plateaus and low coastal wetlands, deserts and scrublands, and everything in between. No other large mammal has ever achieved anything remotely comparable. And we did it with stone tools, fire, and the most powerful adaptation evolution ever created: a human mind capable of solving any problem, overcoming any obstacle, adapting to any environment. And the journey was just beginning. So let's talk about what they actually did all day. Your ancestors, the ones living 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 years ago. Because here is the thing most people get completely wrong. When we picture prehistoric humans, we imagine desperate, dirty, starving savages constantly fighting just to survive one more day, living in caves, eating raw meat, dying young. That is the image popular culture has burned into our brains. But the archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. These people were not primitives, barely clinging to existence. They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers with rich, complex daily lives. And in some ways, they may have lived better than the agricultural societies that would replace them. Let's start with the caves, because that is the first myth we need to destroy. Yes, they sometimes used caves, but mostly as temporary seasonal shelters or ritual spaces. Most of the time, your ancestors lived out in the open. They built sophisticated structures out of wood, bone, and hide. Archaeological sites across Europe show evidence of large communal dwellings that could house 20 or 30 people. And these weren't simple, crude huts either. These structures were carefully designed with interior hearths, designated sleeping areas, and even separate zones for different activities. One site in the present-day Czech Republic reveals a dwelling built from mammoth bones and hides. The bones were arranged in meticulous patterns to create a domed structure, with heavy tusks serving as anchor points. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of multiple hearths positioned to maximize heat distribution. There were storage pits dug into the floorwork areas where stone tools were made, and even what appears to be a designated waste disposal zone, safely distanced from the main living space. These people understood sanitation, thermodynamics, and spatial organization. They were architects. In Africa, the evidence is harder to find, because wood and plant materials decay rapidly in tropical climates. But what we do find suggests even more sophistication. Sites show rings of stones that likely held down the edges of temporary structures made of branches and leaves. But these weren't random campsites. They were carefully chosen locations near water sources, with good sight lines to spot both game and potential threats. They were positioned to catch cooling breezes in the summer and shelter from the wind during cold seasons. Your ancestors read the landscape the way we read books, choosing the optimal location for each camp based on dozens of environmental variables. And they moved constantly, not because they were desperate nomads fleeing starvation, but because they followed a sophisticated seasonal cycle. Modern studies of remaining hunter-gatherer societies clearly showed this pattern, and archaeological evidence suggests it goes back hundreds of thousands of years. Spring in a valley where certain plants become available. Summer near a river for fresh fish. Autumn on the high plateaus where nut trees drop their harvest. Winter back at a base camp where stored food and shelter materials await. It wasn't random wandering. It was an annual cycle as precisely timed as any farmer's planting calendar. Except it required even more detailed environmental knowledge. Think about what that means. Your ancestors knew hundreds, maybe thousands of plant species. Which ones were edible, which were toxic, which could be made edible through processing. They knew when every plant flowered, fruited, and went to seed. They knew which roots could be dug in spring, which berries ripened in summer, which nuts fell in autumn. They could read animal tracks and droppings to identify the species, age, sex, and health of the animal. They understood herd migration patterns across entire regions. They knew where to find water in any season, how to predict weather changes from wind direction and cloud formations, which caves held flint for tools, and which ones had the right clay for pottery. It was a different kind of intelligence than what we value today. But it was just as sophisticated, probably more so in many ways. A modern human dropped into their world would die quickly. If they were dropped into ours, they would probably figure it out eventually. The learning curve might be steep, but the basic cognitive toolkit was already there. And here is what really challenges our assumptions. They didn't work very hard. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherers consistently find the same pattern, about 15 to 20 hours a week spent on what we would call subsistence activities. Hunting, gathering, processing food, maintaining tools. That's it. Compare that to agricultural societies, where farmers worked from dawn to dusk every day during planting and harvesting seasons. Compare it to modern industrial societies, where 40-hour work weeks are considered the standard, and many work far more. Your ancestors had time, a lot of time. What did they do with all those hours? They socialized, they played games, they told stories. They made art. They explored their environment, not out of necessity, but out of curiosity. They experimented with new techniques for making tools, processing food, decorating their bodies. They had leisure, true leisure, in a way that wouldn't exist again for the vast majority of humanity until very recently. A typical day in camp might have looked something like this. Dawn breaks and the camp slowly wakes up. No alarm clocks, no rigid schedules. People get up when they're ready. A fire is rekindled from embers that were banked the night before, a technique that saves the effort of starting new fires from scratch every day. Someone begins preparing the morning meal, likely using leftovers from the night before, plus whatever fresh greens can be gathered quickly nearby. Children play under the loose supervision of everyone around. There are no formal childcare arrangements because everyone watches out for everyone. The entire camp is a shared space. Young kids play games that teach them the skills they will need later. Tracking games where they follow marks in the dirt. Throwing games that build coordination. They are constantly learning, but it doesn't feel like education. It feels like fun. Meanwhile, a few adults head out to check snares set the previous day. Others might wander to a nearby nut grove to see if anything new dropped overnight. It isn't intense labor, it's a morning walk that happens to provide food. They are back by mid-morning with what they found, likely chatting and laughing the whole way. The middle of the day is when the serious work happens, but even that is social. A group decides to go hunting, not because the camp is starving, but because they are craving meat. The weather is right, and someone spotted game tracks yesterday. They prepare their weapons, discuss strategy, and head out as a coordinated team. Or maybe today is a plant gathering day. Another group walks to a spot several miles away where certain tubers are ready to be harvested. They bring digging sticks and foraging bags, working together to extract the tough roots, sharing the labor and the conversation. Back at camp, someone is making new tools, not frantically, not under pressure, but with the careful attention of a craftsman who has the time to do it right. Others might be treating hides, weaving cordage from plant fibers, repairing the dwelling structures. These are all necessary tasks, but they are done in a relaxed, communal atmosphere. People work together, share techniques, and help each other through the difficult parts of the process. Then there is the evidence that truly changes how we think about these people. The care provided to the disabled and the elderly. We find skeletons from this period showing individuals who survived for years, even decades, with severe injuries or disabilities. A Neanderthal skeleton from Iraq reveals a man who had lost an arm years before his death. He couldn't have hunted effectively, couldn't have contributed to the heavy lifting, yet he lived to an old age. Someone cared for him, fed him, protected him. Not necessarily out of genetic obligation, but out of something we might call compassion. Another skeleton from Spain shows signs of a severe spinal deformity that would have left the individual almost immobile from childhood. Yet they lived into their teenage years. For years, someone carried them when the group moved. Someone fed them. Someone made sure they weren't left behind. There was no economic utility in this. It was pure care, and elderly individuals appear regularly in the archaeological record. People who lived well past their reproductive years. In purely Darwinian terms, these individuals consume resources without contributing to genetic fitness. But every hunter-gatherer society we know of values its elders as the keepers of knowledge. They are living encyclopedias of ecological information, survival techniques, and social traditions. They are the ones who remember what to do when rare events happen. The flood that comes once every 30 years. The animal migration that shifts unpredictably. the plant that is usually toxic but becomes edible when processed the right way. Your ancestors understood something that modern society sometimes forgets. A community is strongest when it includes everyone. The disabled person might not hunt, but they could make tools, tend the fires, watch the children. The elderly might not gather food, but they could teach, advise, and settle conflicts. Everyone had value. Everyone had a place. Evenings were the time for magic. The group gathered around the fires as darkness fell. That was when the stories were told. Not just for entertainment, though they certainly were that. These stories were how knowledge passed from one generation to the next. How to find water in the dry season. Which plant cured which illness. Where the herds migrated in different years. All encoded in narratives that were memorable, repeatable, and transmissible across time. That is also when the music happened. Bone flutes from 40,000 years ago show a sophisticated understanding of musical scales. But the tradition is certainly older. Your ancestors sang, drummed, and made rhythmic sounds with whatever materials were at hand. Why? Because humans make music. It is what we do when we have time, when we are together, and when we feel right in the world. And they laughed. We know this not from direct evidence, obviously, but from universal human nature. Every culture alive today laughs, jokes, teases, and plays. There is no reason to think your ancestors 100,000 years ago were any different. The camp at night wasn't just about survival, it was about joy. As the fire died down, people drifted off to sleep. No alarm clocks waiting, no schedules to keep. Just the rhythm of days following nights, seasons following seasons, years flowing into years. They measured time by natural cycles, the waxing and waning moon, the stars turning in their annual patterns, the migrations of animals, and the blooming of plants. It was a good life, sometimes hard, certainly dangerous, yes, but also rich, complex, and deeply satisfying in ways that later agricultural societies would lose. These people had autonomy, leisure, strong social bonds, and an intimate knowledge of their environment. They had art, music, storytelling, and play. They had everything that makes us human, everything that matters. And out of this life of relative abundance and creativity would eventually flow everything else. The innovations that would lead to civilization, the social structures that would become kingdoms, the stories that would become religions, the art that would cover cave walls and eventually canvases. But all of that was still far in the future. For now, your ancestors simply lived and lived well. Imagine walking into a cave in southern France. The year is 1994, and you are part of a team exploring a narrow passage that has been sealed for thousands of years. You squeeze through a tight opening, and your flashlight beam hits the wall. And there, staring right back at you, are lions. Dozens of lions. Perfectly rendered, muscular, alive. No crude stick figures, no primitive scribbles. These are masterpieces. Horses gallop across the limestone. Rhinos charge. Bears lumber forward with a weight you can almost feel. And they are 36,000 years old. Chauvet Cave changed everything we thought we knew about the beginnings of human art. For decades, archaeologists had a comfortable narrative. Human artistic ability developed slowly, gradually, starting with crude scratches and evolving over thousands of years into sophisticated imagery. The famous bulls of Lascaux, painted about 17,000 years ago, were supposed to represent the peak of prehistoric art, the culmination of millennia of development. Then Chauvet was discovered, and that narrative collapsed. Because the paintings at Chauvet aren't just older than Lascaux, they are better, more sophisticated, more dynamic, more technically accomplished in almost every way. The artist who painted those caves 36,000 years ago understood perspective, shading, movement, and anatomical precision at levels that wouldn't be matched again for tens of thousands of years. But here is what really keeps archaeologists awake at night. Chauvet isn't the beginning of this artistic tradition. It can't be. Nobody wakes up one morning and suddenly paints a masterpiece without practice, without training, without a long tradition of learning and experimentation. Which means human artistic ability must go back even further, possibly much further. We just haven't found the older examples yet. Maybe they were painted on rock shelters that weathered away. Maybe they were drawn on wood or hide that rotted into dust. Maybe they are still waiting in caves we haven't discovered. But somewhere, somehow, humans made the leap from basic communication to true art. And we still don't fully understand why. The traditional explanation is that something changed in the human brain around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. A genetic mutation, perhaps, a rewiring of neural pathways. Something that gave us symbolic thought, abstract reasoning, the ability to imagine things that don't exist and then bring them into existence through art. But the more evidence we gather, the less satisfying that explanation becomes. Because artistic impulses appear across the globe in populations that had been separated for thousands of years. In Indonesia, cave paintings date back at least 45,000 years. In Australia, Aboriginal rock art might be even older, though it's notoriously difficult to date precisely. Hand stencils appear in caves from Europe to Asia to Argentina, all showing remarkably similar techniques, created by people who had never met, who had no way to share ideas across oceans and continents. This suggests that art isn't just something that happened once invented by one population and spread around. It is something fundamental to being human. Something that emerged naturally, inevitably, wherever humans had the time, resources, and security to express themselves. But what were they expressing? Why bother spending hours, days, maybe weeks, painting animals on a cave wall when you could be hunting, gathering, making tools, doing something practical that directly aided survival? Walk into any of these painted caves and you immediately sense that something important was happening. These weren't casual doodles. Many of these images are placed in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the cave systems, places you would need torches, ropes, maybe scaffolding to reach. Places where natural light never penetrated. The artist had to carry fire into absolute darkness, mix pigments from minerals, charcoal, and animal fat, and apply them with brushes, their fingers, or perhaps by blowing them through hollow bones. It took effort, deliberate, sustained, difficult effort. They were doing this for a reason. They were trying to achieve something specific. But what? The oldest explanation is hunting magic. Paint the animal, control the animal, ensure a successful hunt by symbolically capturing your prey on the cave wall. It's a satisfying theory, except that most of the animals painted in these caves weren't actually hunted very often. Analysis of bones from nearby living sites shows that the painters mostly ate reindeer. But they mostly painted horses, bison, or dangerous predators like cave lions. Animals they admired, perhaps. Animals that awed them. But not necessarily the animals they ate. Then there is the Lion Man, found in a cave in Germany, carved from mammoth ivory about 40,000 years ago. It's about a foot tall, and it is something utterly impossible. A human body with the head of a lion. Something that never existed, that never could exist, except in someone's imagination. Whoever carved it spent hundreds of hours working the ivory with stone tools, creating something that served absolutely no practical purpose. Nobody was going to eat it, wear it, or use it to hunt, build, or survive. It was pure imagination made real. It was art for art's sake. Or maybe it was religion. The Lion Man might represent a deity, a spirit, a transformed shaman, something beyond the everyday world. It proves that 40,000 years ago, humans weren't just surviving anymore. They were thinking about meaning, identity, the relationship between human and animal, the real and the imagined, the visible and the invisible. The hand stencils are even more direct. Found in caves on every inhabited continent, the technique is always the same. Place your hand on the wall, blow pigment around it. Leave a negative image, a permanent trace. I was here. I existed. Remember me. Some of these hands are small, likely children's. Some show missing fingers, perhaps from frostbite or accidents. One cave in Spain shows hands spanning at least 25,000 years, generation after generation, returning to the exact same spot to add their mark. It is one of the most deeply human things imaginable. The desire to leave something behind, to tell the future I lived, I mattered. Do not forget me. And then there are the Venus figurines. Small, mostly female figures, carved across Europe and Asia, dating from about 35,000 to 10,000 years ago. Some show exaggerated breasts and hips, leading to theories about fertility symbols or mother goddess worship. Others are more realistic. Some show elaborate hairstyles or clothing. A few have faces, though most do not. What were they? Religious objects? Portable? Art dolls? Self-portraits? Nobody knows, but they were important enough for people to carry them over vast distances. Important enough to be carefully shaped from stone ivory or clay. Important enough to be preserved and protected over thousands of years. The debates over Venus figurines reveal just how little we know about prehistoric minds. Modern interpretations tend to project our own assumptions onto the past. Male archaeologists once dismissed them as primitive pornography. Feminist scholars interpreted them as evidence of ancient matriarchies. Others see fertility magic, body acceptance, ancestor worship, or teaching tools. The truth is, we are looking at objects created by people whose worldview was so different from ours that we can barely guess at their meaning. But one thing seems clear. These were not just practical objects. They were meaningful. They mattered to their creators in a way that transcended simple survival. Music might be even older than visual art. Bone flutes discovered in Germany date back over 40,000 years, carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory with precisely spaced finger holes. These are not random objects. They are carefully designed instruments meant to produce specific notes, specific sounds. Someone sat down and worked out the mathematics of sound production, experimented with hole placement, tested different materials. And they did it not because music helped them hunt, gather, or survive, but because humans needed music, needed rhythm, melody, a shared sonic experience. The cave paintings and carvings might have been accompanied by singing, chanting, drumming. Archaeologists have identified parts of caves with unusual acoustics, places where sound resonates in strange, powerful ways. Were these the first concert halls? Places where communities gathered not just to see art, but to experience it, to participate in rituals that combined visual, auditory, and probably kinesthetic elements into overwhelming sensory experiences. Think about what that means. 40,000 years ago, your ancestors weren't just fighting to stay alive. They were creating. They painted, sculpted, carved, played music, danced, and likely told elaborate stories we will never hear. They were building cultures just as rich and complex as anything that would follow. They just didn't have writing to preserve them, cities to memorialize them, or agriculture to support them. But the impulse was there, the need to create, to express, to leave something beautiful behind. It was already fully human, fully developed, fully sophisticated. We didn't become creative. We have always been creative. Art is not something civilization gave us. It is something we brought with us into civilization. Something older and deeper than farming, older than cities, older than almost anything except language itself. And here is something fascinating that researchers are starting to uncover. A large portion of this art might have been created by women, by children, by people traditionally invisible in the archaeological narratives. Hand stencils show that at least half, maybe more, belong to women and adolescents. The detailed, patient work of painting and carving fits the pattern of female labor in many hunter-gatherer societies. The Venus figurines, if they are self-portraits, suggest women creating images of themselves, defining their own identities, rather than being defined by male observers. We spent centuries assuming prehistoric art was made by men. Today, the evidence points the other way. The first artists might have been mothers painting while their kids played nearby, grandmothers passing down techniques through generations, teenagers experimenting with style and meaning. The artistic explosion that happened around 40,000 years ago wasn't a sudden mutation or a miraculous invention. It was the blooming of something that had been building for tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands. Something fundamental to what it means to be human. The need to transform the world, to give it meaning, to leave marks that outlast our brief existences. Your ancestors did this deep in dark caves, by the flickering light of torches. They created beauty for its own sake. They sang songs that have been silent for 40,000 years. They told stories that will never be recovered. But the impulse that drove them is still alive. Every time you draw, sing, dance, or create anything at all, you are participating in a tradition that reaches back into the deepest shadows of prehistory. You are doing what humans have always done, making sense of existence, making survival into something worth living for. And that was just the beginning. Now we have to talk about something that doesn't fossilize, something that leaves only the faintest traces in the archaeological record, but which might be the most important adaptation humans ever developed. Belief. Not belief in the modern sense, Organized religion with priests, temples, and holy scriptures, that came much later. We are talking about something more fundamental, more ancient. The moment humans started believing that death wasn't the end, that there was something beyond the visible world, that the spirits of ancestors still mattered to the living. The evidence is scattered and fragmentary, but it is there if you know where to look. The oldest deliberate burial we've found dates back over 100,000 years. A cave in Israel Kafse Cave, where early modern humans laid their dead to rest with intention and care. Not just tossing bodies into refuse piles or leaving them where they fell, but digging graves, positioning the bodies carefully, sometimes placing objects next to them. Why would you do that? Unless you believed that the dead person still existed in some way, still needed things, still mattered. This is where it gets truly interesting. Neanderthals did it too, maybe even earlier. Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq has given us some of the most haunting evidence of Neanderthal burial practices. Between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago, Neanderthals used this cave as a shelter, a home, probably generation after generation. And when members of their group died, they buried them there, carefully, deliberately, in positions that suggest thought and intention. One burial in particular has captured imaginations for decades. Shanidar 4, as archaeologists call it. When researchers excavated the grave in the 1960s, they found something unexpected: pollen. Large amounts of pollen concentrated around and under the skeleton, in patterns suggesting that flowers had been placed in the grave. Not just any flowers, medicinal plants, yarrow, cornflowers, hollyhocks. Plants that possessed healing properties, that meant something to the people who gathered them. The image is almost unbearably poignant. Neanderthals gathering wild flowers to lay by their dead, standing at the edge of a grave, perhaps saying words we will never know, certainly feeling something we would recognize as grief. There is debate about this, however. Some researchers think the pollen got there through natural processes, burrowing animals or wind. But the concentration patterns are hard to explain away so easily. And even if Shanidar 4 is controversial, there are other Neanderthal burials that clearly show intentional treatment of the dead. Graves with stone tools placed next to the body. Burials where the deceased was positioned in a fetal pose, as if sleeping. A remarkable sight in France where a Neanderthal child was buried with what appears to be a carefully chipped flint tool placed near their hand. This wasn't just corpse disposal. These were rituals, acts of meaning-making in the face of death. What does this tell us about Neanderthal minds, about their inner worlds? It tells us they had crossed a threshold that most animals never approach. They had developed an awareness of death as a permanent state. Not just the absence of movement, but something final and significant. And having grasped that finality, they had developed an immediate response to mark it, ritualize it, maybe even deny it, by creating an afterlife in their imagination. That is huge. That is the beginning of religion, of spirituality, of every philosophical and theological system humans would one day create. But burial is only the most visible evidence. There are other clues, harder to interpret, but just as suggestive. Cave art, for example. When you stand in front of a 30,000-year-old painting on a cave wall, you aren't just looking at a pretty picture. You are looking through a window into someone's mind. And that mind was doing something very strange. Many of the most famous cave paintings are located in extremely difficult-to-reach places, far underground, through tight squeezes into chambers where you had to crawl or wriggle to enter. Why go to all that trouble? Why not paint near the entrance where everyone could see? Because these weren't just decorations. They were sacred images placed in sacred spaces. Some scholars believe these deep caves served as ritual sites, where shamans or spiritual practitioners would enter trance states and communicate with the spirit world. The theory goes like this: isolated in the dark, away from the community, possibly fasting or using psychoactive plant substances, a shaman would enter an altered state of consciousness. In that state, they would experience visions, geometric patterns that would eventually coalesce into animals, human figures, spiritual beings. And then they would paint what they saw. The art itself shows evidence of this process. Many cave paintings include strange geometric symbols, dots, grids, zigzag patterns that researchers believe represent entoptic phenomena, the visual patterns your brain generates during altered states of consciousness. These patterns appear in rock art from Europe to Africa to Asia, suggesting similar practices across vast distances and time spans. The animal figures often seem to emerge from the rock itself, using natural formations as part of the image. A bulge in the cave wall becomes the shoulder of a bison. A crack becomes the blood of a wounded animal. This suggests the artists believed the animal spirits were already in the stone, just waiting to be revealed. And many of these paintings are located near areas with unusual acoustics chambers that resonate strangely, passages where sounds reverberate and distort. Try singing in some of these caves, and your voice transforms into something otherworldly. Did ancient shamans use these acoustic properties to enhance their rituals, creating soundscapes that made the spirit world feel present and real? But it wasn't just caves. The prehistoric landscape was dotted with sacred places. Stone circles, some dating back over 10,000 years. Arrangements of rocks that clearly took massive effort to create, but serve no obvious practical purpose. They aren't defensive structures, they aren't dwellings, they are ritual spaces, places where communities gathered to perform ceremonies we can only guess at. Ochre shows up everywhere in the archaeological record, starting at least 100,000 years ago. This red mineral pigment, sometimes ground into powder, sometimes shaped into crayons, appears in burial sites, living spaces, and what looked like ritual contexts. People painted themselves with it, sprinkled it over the dead, likely used it in ceremonies. Why ochre? Why red specifically? Maybe because it is the color of blood, of life. Using it in burial rituals might have been a way of symbolically returning life to the deceased, or marking them as still part of the living community. Or perhaps the color itself was believed to hold power to ward off spirits or invoke ancestral presence. We are only guessing. But the omnipresence of ochre across time and space tells us it held profound meaning for ancient humans. Dreams probably played a crucial role in early spiritual experiences. Every night, your ancestors entered states of consciousness where the impossible became routine. Dead relatives appeared and spoke. Animals transformed into humans. You could fly, breathe underwater, travel instantly to distant places. How would you interpret those experiences without modern neurological knowledge? Obviously, you would think you were visiting another realm, a spirit world, parallel to the physical one, accessible during sleep or trance states. The dead lived there, Animal spirits resided there, and with the right knowledge, shamans could journey there deliberately to bring back information and power. This dream-based spirituality likely led to ancestor veneration, the belief that deceased family members remained active presences in the community. They could help or harm the living, depending on how they were treated. So you made offerings, told stories about them, kept their memory alive across generations. It created a kind of cultural immortality. Your physical body died, but your memory, your spirit, your influence could persist indefinitely, as long as your descendants remembered you. And that might have been one of the most important functions of religion: social cohesion. Think about the challenges facing a prehistoric community. You have 20, 30, maybe 50 people trying to cooperate, despite competing interests, personal conflicts, and scarce resources. What keeps everyone working together instead of splintering apart or fighting? Shared belief. If everyone believes that the ancestors are watching, judging, expecting certain behaviors, that is powerful social pressure. If everyone participates in the same rituals, visits the same sacred places, tells the same stories about the spirit world, it creates bonds that transcend individual relationships. Religion doesn't just connect humans to the supernatural, it connects humans to each other. Archaeological evidence suggests this binding function was crucial. Sites showing evidence of ritual activity often display less interpersonal violence than those without it. Communities that invested in ceremonies and sacred spaces seem to have been more stable, enduring longer in the archaeological record. Belief made cooperation possible on scales that would have otherwise been impossible. And maybe that is the real miracle. Not that ancient humans developed elaborate mythologies or complex rituals, but that they figured out how to use imagination to change reality. They invented invisible forces, spirits, ancestors, and sacred places. And those inventions changed how people behaved, how communities organized, how culture was transmitted across generations. The spirit world wasn't real in a physical sense, but it was real in its effects. Real enough to bury your dead with flowers. Real enough to crawl deep underground, to paint visions on cave walls. Real enough to assemble stones into circles and perform ceremonies under stars that felt close enough to touch. Your ancestors created meaning in a universe that offered none. They answered the hardest questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? With stories that might not have been literally true, but were true enough to live by. And those stories, those beliefs, those rituals, were adaptations just as important as opposable thumbs or large brains. Maybe more important. Because in the end, what kept human communities together through ice ages, droughts, and countless disasters wasn't just intelligence or technology. It was the shared conviction that something bigger than individual survival mattered. That the dead were still watching. That the spirit world touched this one. That meaning existed beyond mere existence. Whether they were right or wrong matters less than this. It worked. Imagine watching one of your ancestors work a piece of stone. They aren't just banging rocks together. They sit very still, knees pulled up, the raw material in one hand, a carefully chosen striking stone in the other. Every strike has to land at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right force. Too hard, and the stone shatters. Too soft, and nothing happens. Too steep, and the flake plunges into the core. Too flat, and it bounces off. There is no written manual, no YouTube tutorial. Just memory muscle and years spent watching older relatives do the exact same thing. Archaeologists who try to recreate these tools say it can take years of practice to get good at it. Your ancestors were doing this by their teenage years. Some probably specialized in it, just as today some people become carpenters or chefs. In certain African sites, dating back 100,000 years, stone points are so uniform you could stack a dozen of them and see almost no difference in size or shape. That isn't random skill. That is training. That is tradition. And it wasn't the same everywhere. Different regions developed their own styles. Just like pottery or architecture later on, one valley might prefer long, thin spear points. Another might favor broad, leaf-shaped blades. You can almost hear an ancient elder grumbling, "No, we don't do it like the river people." Watch closely. That is what a Stone Age mind really means. Neither simple nor primitive, but a brain tuned to a different kind of problem. How to turn a lump of rock into a tool that could mean the difference between eating and starving, between fending off a predator and becoming food. The stone itself became a kind of language. The shape of a point told you what it was for: slicing meat, scraping hides, boring holes, shaping wood. The flaking patterns told you where it came from, who made it, maybe even what group they belonged to. A single tool carried a history of geology, travel, teaching, and time. And stone was just the beginning. Fire changed everything. You were born into a world where fire is a switch on the wall, a lighter in your pocket, a stove in your kitchen. For most of human history, fire was a miracle you had to earn every single day. By the time our ancestors were fully modern in body and mind, fire was no longer just an occasional gift from a lightning strike. It was a technology, something you could organize around, something you could at least sometimes make. They learned where to find the right wood, how long to dry it, how to shelter embers from wind and rain. They figured out that certain stones, like flint and pyrite, could be struck together to rain sparks onto dry tinder. They learned that glowing embers could be carried in bark cones or hollow bones from camp to camp, packed like precious cargo. Fire turned tough roots and stringy meat into soft, digestible food. It unlocked more calories in every bite. It killed parasites and softened toxins. Over tens of thousands of years, this steady stream of easier energy may have helped support larger brains, smaller guts, and longer childhoods. But fire was more than chemistry. It was choreography. Night in deep time was dangerous. Big cats, hyenas, wolf packs moved through the darkness. Eyes glowed at the edge of vision. Sounds carried strangely. A bright crackling hearth was a bubble of safety where dangerous creatures hesitated to step too close. Inside that circle of light, something new blossomed. Unstructured time. The hunt was over. The gathering was done. The children were fed. There was nowhere to go in the dark. So people talked, repaired tools, told stories, shared memories of distant valleys or strange animals, passed down knowledge that would keep children alive long after their parents were gone. In that shifting orange light, the Stone Age mind didn't just survive. It remembered, imagined, compared, dreamed. And the colder the world got, the more that fire mattered. As the ice ages deepened Your ancestors faced winters that could kill in hours, a wind that sliced through bare skin, snow burying the ground, hiding the food. In those conditions, a fire alone wasn't enough. The body needed armor. At some point, probably multiple times in multiple places, humans made another kind of leap. They stopped just draping hides over their shoulders and started making clothes. It sounds obvious, but it is incredibly sophisticated. To make a fitted garment, you have to skin an animal without tearing the hide. Scrape the inside clean with specialized tools. Dry it or smoke it so it doesn't rot. Soften it with fat brains or plant oils. Punch holes with an awl. Thread sinew or plant fibers through those holes in a repeating pattern that holds the whole thing together. Bone needles with carved eyes show up in Neanderthal and early modern human sites tens of thousands of years ago. That single object implies an entire invisible technology: cutting patterns, fitting garments, tailoring for kids, pregnant women, hunters, elders. Clothing wasn't just warmth, it was mobility. It turned deadly winter landscapes into survivable terrain. When you picture a caveman, don't imagine a half-naked figure shivering in rags. Imagine an experienced person, dressed in layers of carefully tailored, hooded parkas, leggings, mittens, and boots stuffed with insulating grasses. Think Arctic hunter, not cartoon barbarian. To do all this, our ancestors had to become masters of combination. A stone flake in your bare hand is useful but limited. It can cut, but without much leverage. It gives you no reach. If it slips, it cuts you. At some point, humans started doing what no other animal does: building tools out of multiple parts that had to be gathered, processed, and assembled in a precise order. Take a simple hafted spear. To make one, you need a chipped stone point, a straight shaft, likely from a carefully chosen species of wood plant fibers or animal sinew, prepared and twisted into cordage, and a tree resin adhesive mixed with charcoal powder, ochre, or beeswax to get the right consistency. Each of those steps is its own mini technology. You have to know which trees yield the best sap and how to heat it without burning it. You have to recognize the right kind of stone, often miles away. You have to understand that heat changes materials. Resin melts and flows, then cools and hardens. Sinew shrinks as it dries, pulling everything tight. That is abstract thought, cause and effect stretched over hours or days. If I heat this now, it will hold that later. It is also memory. You have to remember the recipes. 3 parts resin, 1 part ash, a dusting of ochre. Not in numbers, but in texture and color. Composite tools like this show up in both Neanderthal and early modern human sites. Whoever made them had to hold a mental blueprint in their head. They were, in a very real sense, engineers, and sometimes their projects were bigger than any one valley. On certain coasts, archaeologists find things that shouldn't be there. Obsidian from far inland shells from distant shores. Red ochre from quarries hundreds of miles away. These aren't random pebbles. They are carefully selected materials, often worked and reworked, passed from hand to hand across vast distances. To move them, you needed more than feet. There is growing evidence that humans, and probably Denisovans before them, were crossing stretches of open water tens of thousands of years ago. The islands of Southeast Asia were never entirely connected to the mainland, even when sea levels were lowest. Yet stone tools show up there and then on islands beyond in sequences that suggest deliberate voyages. We don't have their boats. Wood and fiber rarely survive that long. But we can infer them from what must be true. To cross a strait, you have to float. To float safely with gear and children, you need better than a single log. Maybe rafts of lashed timber or bundles of reeds. Maybe hollowed-out trunks shaped by fire and stone tools. Whatever it was, you have to see the water not as a barrier, but as a road. You have to plan your route, remember landmarks, understand tides and currents well enough not to be swept endlessly into the open ocean. Again, it is a different kind of mind than ours, but not a lesser one. On land, hunting was changing too. For a long time, humans and Neanderthals relied on thrusting spears. You got close to the animal, braced yourself, and drove the point in with your entire body weight. Dangerous, exhausting, but effective. Then someone, somewhere, thought to extend the arm itself. A spear thrower, or atlatl, is a simple device, a lever with a hook at one end. You notch a light spear into that hook. Whip your arm forward, and the thrower multiplies your throwing power. A spear thrown with an atlatl can go much further and hit much harder than any dart thrown by hand. To invent that, you have to notice something subtle. Longer levers throw things faster. You have to experiment with angles, lengths, and weights until the motion feels right. The first atlatl-like tools probably appeared tens of thousands of years ago. They made hunting safer by letting humans stand further from a charging animal, and more efficient by increasing success rates. Later, still somewhere in Africa or Eurasia, came another revolution, the bow and arrow. Now, instead of throwing the whole projectile, you store energy in a bent piece of wood and release it into a tiny shaft. The bow is a machine made of tension, elasticity, and timing. It requires perfectly straight arrows, standardized points, fletching, and a string that can withstand constant strain. It takes years of practice to shoot well, but once mastered, it transforms the relationship between human and animal. You can hunt smaller, faster game. You can strike while hidden. You can defend your group from a distance. The bow turned human hands into something deadlier and more flexible than claws or fangs. Behind all these inventions lay a network of exchange. Some valleys had rich flint deposits, others had none. Some coasts had perfect shells for beads, others didn't. Some cliffs bled a deep red ochre that could be ground into paint or used in rituals. That color shows up in caves and burials hundreds of miles from its source. That means people were traveling or trading with distant groups. A piece of obsidian in your camp might have passed through the hands of 10 different people, crossing rivers and mountains, moving steadily along a chain of kinship and mutual obligation. Trade was more than economics. It was an information flow. When a hunter from the east showed up with a new style of spear point, others saw it, copied, it improved it. Ideas started moving faster than genes, jumping from one group to another, from one region to another. That is why, across vast stretches of land, we sometimes see similar tool traditions emerging almost simultaneously. Not because everyone had the same random idea at the exact same moment, but because the Stone Age mind lived on a network. Viewed from the outside, looking at the timeline, it can seem maddeningly slow. A particular type of tool appears, then sticks around for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. To modern eyes, used to new phones every few years, it can look like stagnation. But remember the scale of their lives. If you are born into a world where a particular spear point, a particular way of making fire, a particular style of clothing, keeps everything you love alive year after year, there is no urgent reason to change it. Innovation is risky. New designs can fail catastrophically. A bad experiment with glue or shaft wood could mean an injured hunter lost prey a winter of starvation. There was no mass market, no advertising, no pressure to upgrade. There was only the silent, constant test of reality. Does this work or not? Change, when it came, was often triggered by external forces. A shift in climate, a new animal moving into the area, a rival group showing up with better tools. Under those pressures, small tweaks mattered. A sharper edge, a stronger binding, a warmer boot. These adjustments accumulated slowly, almost invisibly, over hundreds of generations. If you could compress those tens of thousands of years into a few minutes, history would look very different. You would see blades shrinking and lengthening, points narrowing and thickening, new materials appearing, old techniques fading, hearths changing shape and layout, camps shifting their arrangements, sewing needles appearing and then multiplying, distant shells washing up inland, ochre use intensifying, atlatls and bows spreading from valley to valley. It wouldn't seem slow at all. It would look like what it was, minds just like yours, thinking their way through a dangerous, beautiful, unpredictable world. Stone, fire, clothing, glue, boats, levers, bows, trade. None of these were separate from the people who used them. They shaped the rhythms of the day, the stories told at night, the limits of what felt possible. They were the physical shadows of an invisible thing, a brain that could imagine a future different from the present, and then reach out into the world and build it. Flake by flake, stitch by stitch, spark by spark. Imagine waking up in that world, not as a lone survivor in a wasteland, but as a member of a tiny, tight-knit band, maybe 20, 30, 50 people at most. That is your entire social universe. Everyone you know, everyone you love, everyone you argue with, everyone you rely on, is sleeping within a few dozen paces of you. There is no anonymity, no strangers, no crowds to disappear into. Every decision you make, every mistake, every act of generosity or selfishness is noticed, remembered, woven into the ongoing story your group tells about itself. Anthropologists call these band societies, the smallest, most intimate kind of human community. No villages, no cities, no written laws, just a handful of extended families moving together across the landscape, following the seasons, the animals, the ripening plants. And at that small scale, everything changes. In a band of 30 people, you can't really have a dictator. You can't have a king with a palace or a general with an army. If someone starts barking orders at everyone, there is a simple solution. People leave. They pack up their few belongings, their kids, their tools, and join another group, or form a new camp a few valleys over. Power in this world is fragile. So most researchers believe these early human bands were relatively egalitarian, not in the sense that everyone was identical, but in the sense that nobody could hoard too much power without facing consequences. Leadership was probably fluid, shifting with the context. One person might guide a hunt because they knew the migration routes. Another might take the lead when it came to finding water, reading the clouds, understanding the subtle signs of the landscape. An elder might carry the authority of memory, knowing where the group survived a drought 40 years ago, or where a hidden spring lay in the basalt hills. Decisions were likely made during long, slow conversations. People sitting around a fire after dark, voices low, half-asleep kids on their parents' laps. We see echoes of this in recent foraging societies, drawn-out discussions, teasing, joking, nudging, until some kind of consensus emerges. No voting, no raising of hands, just a gradual alignment of opinions until it feels wrong to push any further. If someone tried to dominate the group, had soft weapons, laughter, mockery, the refusal to cooperate. In many traditional foraging cultures, arrogant hunters are publicly teased, their kills downplayed, their boasting undercut by humor. It's a social technology to keep everyone in check, to prevent the rise of tyrants when your survival depends on cooperation, not obedience. But while each band was small and relatively equal internally, it was never truly isolated. We know this from the stones. Archaeologists constantly find tools made from rocks that aren't native to where they are found. Obsidian blades showing up hundreds of miles from the nearest obsidian source. Shell beads far inland. Pigments that had to be carried across mountain ranges and deserts. This isn't random wandering. It's evidence of networks. Imagine your band has a favorite campsite near a river. Once a year in the dry season, you aren't the only ones to show up. 2, 3, maybe 4 other bands arrive. Old friends, distant cousins, people you haven't seen since last year. The river camp transforms from a quiet circle of shelters into a bustling seasonal gathering. Information flows. Who found a new flint source? Where have the herds moved? Which valleys are dry? Which are dangerous? Which are strangely quiet? Objects flow too. A spear point from far to the north is handed to you in exchange for a bundle of red ochre from your hills. A shell necklace from the coast makes its way, trade by trade, into the hands of someone who has never seen the sea. But the most important exchanges aren't tools or pigments. They are people. Genetic evidence shows that early humans didn't breed randomly within isolated clans. There were patterns, structured exchanges of marriage partners between groups. This suggests something like rules, even if they were never written down. Maybe you couldn't marry someone from your own band. Or maybe you had to find a partner among your mother's kin or your father's allies. We don't know the exact systems, but we see the signature of distant bands regularly linked by kinship. Think about what that means emotionally. When your band goes to that seasonal gathering, you aren't just trading stone and meat. You are seeing your sister, who married into another band 5 years ago. You are meeting a nephew for the first time. You are negotiating marriages for the teenagers who were just kids at the last gathering. The human world is bigger than your daily campsite, but it is still bound by the language of family. And then there are the grandparents. In almost every other primate species, when you are too old to reproduce, your evolutionary story is basically over. But humans are different. We have long post-reproductive lifespans. Grandmothers and grandfathers who keep living for decades after they can no longer have children themselves. Why? One of the leading ideas is the grandmother hypothesis. It suggests that older women, no longer tied down by their own pregnancies and nursing, played a crucial role in feeding and protecting their grandchildren. A grandmother who could dig up hard-to-find tubers or crack tough nuts with her years of experience allowed her daughter to have more kids spaced closer together. Her genes benefited not through direct reproduction, but by keeping her descendants alive. Now apply that to the scale of a whole band. Elders are walking libraries. They remember places no one in the prime of life has ever seen. They remember which plants are safe, which are toxic, which only become edible after being soaked, dried, or roasted in a specific way. They remember the stories of the last time the rains failed, the last time strangers came over the ridge, the last time the river ran red with floodwater. In a world without writing, without archives, without the internet, knowledge lives inside people's minds. And those who have been alive the longest carry the densest, most compressed data. Children spent their days partly with parents, partly in wild, chaotic play with other kids, but also partly at the knees of their grandparents, listening to stories, being corrected, absorbing the rules, the myths, the survival hacks, without even realizing they were learning. This three-generation unit, grandparents, parents, children, might have been one of the key drivers of human cultural evolution. Everything in this world relies on cooperation. Hunting big game isn't something one person does heroically with a spear. It is dangerous, messy, highly coordinated. Some people drive the herd, others wait in ambush. Some distract, some kill, some finish off the wounded. If one person panics or rushes in too early, the whole plan falls apart, and people can die. Childcare is shared too. In many modern foraging societies, alloparenting care, provided by people other than the biological parents, is the norm. Aunts, uncles, older siblings, grandparents, even unrelated camp members, all pitch in. Your survival doesn't just depend on your mother. It depends on a whole network of adults who will pick you up when you cry, carry you when you're tired, feed you, pull thorns from your feet, and teach you which bugs will stain your fingers and which will wreck your guts. Food, when found, is rarely hoarded. Sharing meat is almost universal among hunter-gatherers. This doesn't come from pure, angelic generosity. It is a long-term survival strategy. You give today when you are lucky, so that someone else will give to you tomorrow when your luck runs out. Over tens of thousands of years, natural selection favored minds that could manage this kind of social accounting. Who shared last time? Who cheats? Who pulls their weight? Who is generous even when they are tired? Our brains are wired to track reciprocity in agonizing detail. Because in these small bands, reputation is everything. Lose your reputation for fairness, and you might lose your access to future help. But cooperation was never perfect. Beneath the warmth of the campfire and the gentle rituals of sharing lay something darker. Skeletons from deep time sometimes tell stories that are not peaceful. Healed fractures on skulls, broken noses, forearms with old defensive breaks where someone threw up an arm to block a blow. Arrow or spear points lodged in bone. At rare sites, clusters of bodies with signs of violent death, blunt force trauma, embedded projectiles, no signs of careful burial. These scenes look disturbingly like massacres. Conflict wasn't invented by civilization. It is older than writing, older than farming, older than cities. But in the world of bands, it probably looked different from modern warfare. There were no mass armies, no generals deploying thousands of men. Imagine instead sudden ambushes at dawn, a raid on a sleeping camp to steal women, children, food, tools. A quick, brutal clash around a waterhole when two desperate, exhausted bands arrive, and there simply isn't enough for everyone. A long, simmering feud between groups that boils over when a hunting accident kills someone's brother and is interpreted as an attack. Yet that same fragile ecology that could spark conflict also made prolonged war unappealing. Losing a few hunters in a tiny band isn't just a tragedy, it's catastrophic. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone is someone's cousin, someone's in-law. A single act of revenge can ripple through the entire social network. So there were likely peace rituals too, gift exchanges, arranged marriages designed to soothe grievances. Every individual in this world has to walk a tightrope between two opposing forces. On one side is autonomy, your desire to do what you want, go where you want, hunt how you want, fall in love with whoever you want. On the other side is cohesion, your need for the group, for protection, for help raising kids, for access to shared resources, for the comfort of familiar faces in the firelight. Lean too far toward autonomy, and you risk exile. Lean too far toward conformity, and you risk suffocation, anger, resentment. The balance is constantly renegotiated, moment to moment, conversation to conversation. You might push back against a suggestion to move camp, arguing to stay near a grove of fruit trees. You might refuse a marriage proposal. You might secretly meet someone from another band at a seasonal gathering. Human social life has always had a hidden layer of quiet resistance and personal dreams, even in the most communal environments. What holds it all together? The cooperation, the conflict, the memory, the identity is language. Not just a few grunts and cries, but a rich, structured language capable of expressing who owes what to whom, who is related to whom, which plant to gather when the moon is in a particular phase, how to knap a stone or weave a net, what happened long before you were born. Around the fire at night, storytelling isn't entertainment layered on top of survival. It is survival. A story about an ancestor who ignored a certain cloud formation and got caught in a deadly storm is a way of encoding meteorology into narrative. A myth about spirits living in a particular ravine might actually be a deeply memorized warning about rockfalls, snakes, or flash floods. Children fall asleep listening to these stories. As they do, their brains silently build mental maps of the world. Who to trust, where to go, what to fear, what to hope for. Adults listen too, correcting details. Adding new episodes, arguing over interpretations. The stories themselves evolve generation after generation, adapting to new conditions, just like genes. Through language, a band of 30 people can carry the experience of thousands of years. The lessons learned from a drought 100 generations ago can still influence how someone makes a decision tomorrow morning. And because bands are linked across those long-distance networks, the stories travel too. They flow with the obsidian blades and the shell beads. A tale that started on one end of a continent might centuries later echo faintly in the ritual of a group thousands of miles away. When we look back at this world today from our cities, our nations, and our digital networks, it is easy to imagine those small bands as simple, but their social worlds were nothing of the sort. They were dense, layered, fragile, and resilient all at once. Built on family ties and trade partnerships, rivalries and friendships, whispered rumors and public jokes, oaths sworn by the fire and quiet acts of kindness in the dark. That was the social laboratory where humanity was forged, where cooperation became our greatest strength, where conflict sharpened our intelligence and caution, where grandparents became libraries, where language became a lifeline, and where the complex dance between the individual and the group began to take the shape we still live with today. And all of it, every argument, every alliance, every lullaby, hummed in the dark, happened under the exact same stars we see now, in a world that looked almost nothing like ours, yet laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Imagine looking at the last 2 million years, not as a straight line, but as the trace of a heart rate monitor. Up, down, up, down. Warm periods and cold periods pulsing through deep time. This is the Pleistocene, the Ice Age. For most of this era, the world your ancestors knew was not stable. It oscillated. Sometimes slowly, over tens of thousands of years, sometimes with sudden brutality. Within a few human lifetimes, temperatures could drop by several degrees. Rain belts shifted. Forests turned into grasslands. Grasslands into deserts, and back again. If you could fast forward through those millennia, you would see massive ice sheets breathing in and out. Glaciers rolling down off the shoulders of mountains, swallowing valleys, then retreating again. Sea levels dropping hundreds of feet as water locked up in ice, then rising to flood ancient coastlines, drowning places where people had once walked. Your ancestors didn't see the graphs or the climate models. They saw the symptoms: rivers shrinking, animals vanishing from familiar valleys, the snow line creeping further down the hills, where they had gathered berries the year before. They saw storms in seasons that were usually calm, and they had to react. Every time the climate flickered, human populations flickered with it. Some groups found themselves stranded as rising seas flooded coastal plains. Others found their hunting grounds buried under advancing ice. A few were suddenly gifted with new wetlands or grasslands as rainfall patterns shifted. To us, these are just lines on a graph. To them, every shift was a matter of life or death. Geneticists can still see the imprint of these crises in our DNA, time and time again. The genetic record shows the same pattern expansions and crashes. Moments when the human population grew, spread, diversified, and then suddenly contracted. The bottleneck you've heard of before wasn't the only close call. It was just the most extreme. Later in the Pleistocene, there were other trials. Some seemed to align with massive volcanic eruptions, like the Toba supereruption about 74,000 years ago. An explosion so powerful, it might have thrown enough ash into the atmosphere to dim the sun, trigger years of cold, and disrupt ecosystems across entire continents. Did it almost wipe us out again? Some researchers think so. Others argue the effects were more regional, that humans in Africa and Asia fared better than we once believed. The proof isn't absolute, but the pattern that matters is clear. Our numbers dropped. The diversity of our genes narrowed. Once again, we squeezed through a tight door. These bottlenecks weren't clean, simple events. They were chaotic, uneven crises. Some regions were hit hard, others spared. Some lineages died out, others thrived in hidden corners. But the cumulative effect was the same. Time and time again, humanity walked the edge of the precipice. Then, toward the end of the Pleistocene, came one of the harshest tests of all, the last glacial maximum. Imagine the world roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. If you live in North America or Europe today, much of what you know would have been unrecognizable. Two colossal ice sheets sat on the northern hemisphere. In North America, the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets crushed forests, reshaped mountains, and pushed south, reaching in some places almost to where New York and Chicago are today. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet blanketed Scandinavia and much of northern Germany and Poland. Under those ice sheets, nothing human could live. No plants, no animals, no soil. Just miles of grinding ice. South of the glaciers, conditions weren't exactly comfortable either. Winters were longer, colder, drier. Howling winds blew off the ice fronts, picking up dust and dropping it in thick layers of loess across Europe and Asia. Vast areas that had once been mixed forests turned into open, freezing steppes. Sea levels plunged more than 300 feet below what you see today, exposing wide continental shelves. There were land bridges where there are now seas between Siberia and Alaska, between Britain and mainland Europe, between parts of Southeast Asia. For modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans, this wasn't just a little chilly. It was a full-body challenge. To survive, people needed more than warm coats. They needed strategies. They needed places to hide from the worst of the cold. These places are what scientists call refugia. A refugium is like a secret room in the Earth's climate mansion. While blizzards rage through the halls and corridors, a few sheltered rooms stay just warm enough for life to hold on. Maybe a coastal strip where ocean currents bring milder air, a deep valley protected from the wind, or a river system that keeps flowing even in drought. During the last glacial maximum, refugia became the cradles of survival. In Europe, human groups fell back from the advancing ice and huddled in southern strongholds. The Iberian Peninsula, parts of Italy, the Balkans, the regions around the Black Sea. In these cold but not totally lethal pockets, people could still find game, fuel, and fresh water. In Asia, the story was more complex. Some groups likely hugged the coastlines, leaning on marine resources, fish, shellfish, seals, relatively shielded from the worst of the continental chill. Others retreated to river valleys and lush plains, where herds still grazed on hardy grasses. In Africa, the ice sheets didn't advance, but the climate still shifted dramatically. Some areas dried out, others became more seasonal or unstable. Populations contracted into more favorable zones along rivers, in highlands, with reliable rain in pockets where forest and grassland mixed. Inside these refugia, life shrank. Territories grew smaller. People probably moved less, coming to know every rock, every grove of trees, every animal trail within a few days' walk. Social networks may have thinned as the distances between safe zones stretched. Isolation increased. Different refugia developed their own tool styles, their own customs, their own ways of telling stories around the fire. If you could sit quietly by one of those fires, you would have seen a daily life very different from the lush interglacial periods of the past. Clothing was no longer optional. It was armor. People wore layers of hide and fur sewn with bone needles so fine they still astonish archaeologists today. They made tailored garments, leggings, parkas, soft fur-lined boots, hoods designed to trap warm air. Shelters weren't just windbreaks made of branches and leaves. They were engineered spaces. In parts of Ice Age Europe, people built semi-permanent dwellings using mammoth bones as a framework, covered with hides and insulated with earth and snow. Caves became long-term homes, with hearths carefully placed to draw smoke up and out, leaving the living spaces relatively clear. And at the center of it all was the hunt. The Pleistocene world, even in its coldest phases, was full of giants. Mammoths and mastodons roaming the steppe, woolly rhinos in the Americas, giant ground sloths the size of small trucks, armored glyptodons like living tanks, herds of massive bison in Eurasia, towering aurochs, wild horses and cave bears that claimed the darkest underground chambers for themselves. For humans, these animals were both a danger and a salvation. Hunting a mammoth wasn't just about meat. It was about everything. A single kill could feed a band for weeks. The hide could become clothing, shelter, covers, bags. The sinews became thread. The bones became tools, building materials, even fuel. The fat could be burned for light or stored as dense energy for lean times. But taking down something that massive, in freezing temperatures, often with wind whipping ice crystals into your face, wasn't just a matter of bravery. It was a matter of finely tuned knowledge and cooperation. You had to know the migration routes, the weak points in a herd's defensive circle, how the ice and snow would support or betray your footing. Hunters might drive animals toward concealed pits or boggy ground where their own weight worked against them. Spears, sometimes tipped with carefully knapped stone or bone points, had to be thrown with precision. In some regions, they used atlatls to hurl projectiles further and harder than a bear could strike. Every aspect of the hunt was learned behavior, taught from one generation to the next, refined, shared between bands. One bad decision could mean broken bones, frostbite, or a whole group facing starvation a month later. And it wasn't just the hunt. Your ancestors had to compete with other predators, wolf packs, prides of lions, solitary saber-toothed cats that often stalked the same herds. Sometimes stealing a kill from other carnivores was safer than making one yourself. Sometimes it was a deadly gamble. When archaeologists look at Ice Age butchery sites, they see the evidence of this constant tension. Cut marks on bones overlapping with the tooth marks of wolves or big cats. Scattered remains suggesting a rushed butchering, a quick retreat before other predators arrived. For a long time, these massive Ice Age animals seemed like permanent fixtures of the landscape. But by the end of the Pleistocene, most of them were gone. Almost everywhere you look, the timeline is the same. As the climate warmed after the last glacial maximum, megafauna populations began to shrink. In many regions, their final disappearance happens within a few thousand years of modern humans arriving, or humans utilizing new, more efficient hunting technologies. Did we kill them all? Some scholars argue yes, or at least that we finished what the climate started. The overkill hypothesis suggests that even small human populations, armed with cooperation, fire, and sharp tools could take a heavy toll on slow-reproducing giants. An extra mortality rate of just a few % each year could push species already stressed by shifting vegetation over the edge. Others point out that the picture isn't so clean. Some megafauna died out in places where human presence seems late or sparse. Some survived for thousands of years alongside humans in isolated refugia, like mammoths lingering on Arctic islands long after vanishing from mainland Siberia. Ice cores and lake sediments show rapid climate oscillations, exactly when many of these animals disappear, suggesting the ecosystems themselves were in turmoil. The truth likely lies in between. Climate change altering habitats, shortening growing seasons, shifting plant communities, and humans adding an extra layer of pressure. More efficient hunting of adults, the use of fire to shape landscapes, sometimes to the detriment of large grazers. Competition for the same nutrient-rich patches of land. Whatever combination of forces caused the extinctions, the result was profound. The ecosystems that had shaped human evolution for hundreds of thousands of years vanished. The mammoth steppe, the giant-browsed forests, the world of cave bears and saber-tooths faded away. New assemblages of animals took their place: deer, smaller bovids, wild pigs, smaller carnivores. Humans adapted again, because that is the other thread running through all these ice ages and collapses: movement. Every climate shift turned the world into a shifting maze. Grasslands advanced into old deserts. Forests pushed into the tundra. Coastlines moved dozens of miles inland or out to sea. Rivers carved new channels or dried up and vanished. Your ancestors followed, sometimes slowly over generations as herds gradually shifted their range and people moved with them. Sometimes abruptly, when a drought struck or a once reliable valley failed them. Groups that had lived in one area for thousands of years found themselves gradually or suddenly somewhere else. These movements weren't random wandering. They were guided by memory, rumor, and careful exploration. Scouts pushing a little further each season. Tales of distant valleys where rain still fell. Faint tracks of migrating herds leading toward unknown horizons. Over thousands of years, those small steps added up to continental journeys, across exposed land bridges into new worlds, along coastlines now swallowed by modern seas, through mountain passes that would eventually become political borders and trade routes. Every time the climate shifted, human cultures shifted with it. New tools, new hunting strategies, new shelters, new rituals to make sense of a landscape that never stayed the same for long. By the time the ice sheets began their final retreat about 15,000 years ago, your species had become experts at living with uncertainty. You carried in your traditions the deep, instinctive understanding that the world could flip in a lifetime, that rivers could disappear, that animals could vanish, that winter could harden and refuse to let go. That hard-won flexibility, that ability to move, to innovate, to cooperate under pressure, would become the most important inheritance of all. Because as the ice retreated and new lands opened up, those same survival skills were about to be turned toward something new. Instead of just enduring what nature threw at you, you were going to start slowly, tentatively, reshaping nature itself. The Ice Age was ending. The age of fields and villages was drawing closer just over the horizon. Fast forward in time. For tens of thousands of years after the first great expansions out of Africa, human life followed a kind of rhythm. Ice ages come and go. Glaciers advance and retreat. Forests turn to grassland and back again. But through it all, your ancestors adapt without fundamentally changing what they are. They are foragers, hunters, gatherers, fishers. They move with the seasons, follow the herds, track the ripening plants. They live in small bands and loose networks tied together by kinship, storytelling, and trade. Their technology improves. Their art blossoms. Their rituals deepen. But the basic pattern of life remains recognizably the same. Then, very late in the story, almost at the end of the Ice Age, the rhythm stutters. About 12,800 years ago, just as the world is slowly warming, something strange happens. The climate suddenly snaps back to glacial conditions. Temperatures plunge. In the northern hemisphere, ice sheets stop retreating, and in some places start advancing again. Rainfall patterns shift. Ecosystems falter. This cold snap has a name, the Younger Dryas. For your ancestors, it wouldn't have been a line on a climate graph. It would have been a string of bad years, then worse years, then a new normal that looked nothing like what they expected. In the Levant, what is now Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and surrounding areas, people had been enjoying a kind of golden age for hunter-gatherers. The end of the last ice age had brought milder winters, wetter conditions, and flourishing stands of wild cereals. Barley, wheat, rye, growing in dense patches like natural buffets. Herds of gazelle and other game grazed nearby. Rivers and springs were reliable. For the first time in human history, you could stay put for much of the year and still eat well. Then the Younger Dryas hit. The climate grew drier and colder. Those lush patches of wild grain shrank. Some springs dried up. Animal populations moved or declined. For the people who had started building semi-permanent villages, this was a crisis of expectations. You can wander when you travel light. It's harder when you've already started to settle down. Faced with this new unpredictability, human groups along the eastern Mediterranean seem to have tried something radically different. Instead of just moving to where the food was, they started modifying the food itself. Not all at once, not as a grand plan, but as a series of small, desperate, clever experiments. Imagine a group of foragers looking at a shrinking patch of wild barley. They know this plant. They have been harvesting it for generations. They've seen what happens when animals trample the seeds into the mud. They've noticed that if you drop a few grains near camp, new plants sometimes sprout the next year. Now resources are tight. You can't rely on just walking over to the next valley to find plenty. Every patch of grain counts. So someone, an old woman who has watched plants her whole life, a curious child, a hunter waiting out a storm, starts gathering not just the seeds, but the dirt around them. They scatter those seeds closer to camp, where they can watch them and protect them. If you do this once, nothing really changes. If you do it every year for centuries, selecting the plumpest seeds, the stalks that don't shatter as easily, something begins to shift. This is the beginning of farming. At first, it doesn't look like agriculture. People still gather, still hunt, still move around, at least part of the year. But they are also coaxing plant populations, pulling weeds around their favorite patches, burning tracts of land to encourage certain species, saving seeds from good years to plant in bad ones. Early animal management probably starts the same way. If you follow herds of wild gazelle or sheep, you notice their behavior. Which animals are aggressive? Which are calm? Which mothers protect their young? Over time, people might have started selectively culling or protecting certain individuals, favoring the tamer animals, guiding their movements, maybe corralling them temporarily in natural enclosures. It isn't full-blown animal husbandry yet. It is more like a growing intimacy between humans and certain animals, a blurred line between predator and manager. The younger Dryas doesn't last forever. After about 1,200 years, the world warms up again sharply. Ice sheets retreat, sea levels rise, vegetation zones sprint northward. But by then, in certain regions, your ancestors are already on a path that will be hard to walk back from. They have experimented with stabilizing nature on a small scale and discovered that it can be bent. Out of this period of experimentation and stress emerges one of the strangest sights in all of archaeology. Göbekli Tepe, on a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey. About 11,600 years ago, people started building something that shouldn't exist, at least not according to our old stories about how civilization began. At Göbekli Tepe, there are no houses, no storage pits full of domesticated grain, no obvious signs of a settled farming life. The people who came here were almost certainly still hunter-gatherers, moving across the landscape behind migrating herds, gathering wild plants, fishing in the rivers. And yet on this isolated ridge, they erected stone circles made of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing over 10 tons. The stones are carved with reliefs of animals: lions, boars, foxes, vultures, snakes, scorpions. Some feature abstract symbols. 2 central pillars in each circle stand like stylized human figures, with hands carved along their sides, belts and loincloths etched into the stone. To build these circles, hundreds of people would have had to coordinate. Someone had to quarry the stone. Someone had to drag it. Someone had to carve the images. Someone had to plan the layout, align the pillars, oversee the work. Others had to feed the workers, organize the tools, manage the site. Göbekli Tepe looks in many ways like a temple, a ritual gathering place, a ceremonial center where scattered bands converged at certain times of the year to feast, to perform rites, to renew alliances. It suggests that organized large-scale symbolic architecture didn't wait for agriculture and cities. It came first. In a way, Göbekli Tepe flips the old story upside down. Instead of farming, creating the surplus that allowed for monuments, it might be that the desire for shared ritual space, for grand gatherings and feasts, helped push people toward more intensive food production. If you want to host a festival for hundreds of guests every year, wild resources alone might not be reliable enough. You start cultivating grain, not because you love farming, but because you need to feed a crowd. Around the same time, further south and west, another culture is walking the transition between foraging and farming in a more gradual, everyday way. Archaeologists call them the Natufians. From about 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, Natufian communities thrived in the Levantine corridor in Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Western Syria, and Jordan. They are some of the first people we know of to build permanent stone houses, while still relying heavily on wild foods. Natufian villages are small clusters of semicircular houses, partially dug into the ground with stone foundations and brush or thatch roofs. Inside we find grinding stones, mortars and pestles worn smooth by years of use, suggesting intensive processing of wild grains and nuts. Outside we find cemeteries with carefully placed burials, sometimes adorned with shell beads or animal parts. These people aren't farmers yet. They hunt gazelle and deer. They gather wild barley wheat and oats. They collect nuts, fruits, and seeds. But they are also staying put for much of the year. They are investing in solid structures. They are returning to the exact same spots generation after generation. Over time, some Natufian sites grow larger and more complex. Settling down, staying in one place year-round or almost year-round is a profound shift. When your camp is temporary, possessions are a burden. You own what you can carry, a few tools, some clothes, maybe an ornament or two. Social hierarchies are hard to lock in place when anyone can just walk away. When you start building houses that last for decades, maybe longer, everything changes. You can store food, grain in pits, nuts in baskets, dried meat hanging from the rafters. You can accumulate heavy stone grinding tools, large vessels. You can mark specific spots as yours, a house, a hearth, a burial ground. Land begins to take on the meaning of property, rather than just habitat. Settling down also allows for new kinds of social relationships. Grandparents can live near their grandchildren. Ancestors can be buried under the floors of houses, tying living families to specific addresses through memory and ritual. Feasting can become more elaborate when you have fixed places to host it. Alliances and rivalries can deepen when you see the same neighboring bands every single season. But settling down has a cost. For mobile foragers, the landscape is like a vast buffet. If one patch is overhunted or a nut grove fails, you go somewhere else. Your body is adapted to varied diets and constant movement. For the most part, hunter-gatherers are surprisingly healthy, tall with strong bones, relatively little tooth decay, and low rates of many chronic diseases. Once you commit to a specific valley or hillside, you are tied to its fate. If the local harvest fails, you can't always leave. Your house, your fields, your buried ancestors are here. Your neighbors are competing for the same nearby resources. It becomes harder to avoid conflict simply by walking away. As people begin to cultivate plants more systematically, another shift occurs. Diets narrow. In many regions, early farmers rely heavily on one or two staple crops: wheat and barley in the Near East, millet and rice in parts of Asia, maize in the Americas. These foods are efficient sources of calories, especially in good years. But a life built around porridge and bread is nutritionally less diverse than a seasonal hunter-gatherer diet of roots, nuts, fruits, meat, and wild greens. The skeletal remains of early farming communities show the effects. Average height drops. Bones show signs of heavier labor. Tooth wear increases from the grit of grinding stones left in the grain, and cavities surge. Signs of anemia and other nutritional stress appear more frequently. In many early farming villages, infant mortality goes up. Inequality creeps in too. Grain can be stored, counted, controlled. Fields can be claimed, parceled out, defended. Those who manage the surplus, who guard the granaries, coordinate the labor, or claim ancestral rights to the best land, have new ways to wield power. Over generations, the status differences that might have been fluid in small bands begin to harden. Freedom of movement, which was once a simple option, becomes complicated. Leaving a village means abandoning land, stores, graves, social obligations. A bad leader, an unfair system, a rising hierarchy are much harder to escape when home isn't just where you stand, but where your ancestors rest and your food grows. All of this might make the shift to farming sound like a kind of destiny, a one-way march toward civilization that began the moment people got smart enough. But the evidence suggests something more nuanced, and in many ways, more unsettling. The turn toward agriculture was not inevitable. For tens of thousands of years, humans with brains exactly like ours did not farm, even though they knew plants intimately, used fire to shape landscapes, and understood animal behavior in astonishing detail. Even after the first experiments with cultivation, many groups chose to remain hunter-gatherers, or to mix foraging and farming for thousands of years. In some regions, people tried early agriculture and then walked away from it when conditions changed. The decisive pushes seem to happen in specific times and places when climate shifts make wild resources less predictable, when growing populations press against the carrying capacity of rich, stable environments, or when ritual centers and social networks demand regular feasts and offerings, creating pressure for surplus. In other words, farming emerges as a series of local solutions to local problems, not as a universal upgrade. Every valley, every coastline, every river plain tells its own story of experimentation, failure, partial adoption, and then, only gradually, full commitment. From the perspective of deep time, this moment, these few thousand years, when some humans tether themselves to fields and villages for the first time, is both sharp and bittersweet. On one side of the threshold is a world where your ancestors moved through open landscapes, following migrating herds, visiting sacred hills and caves to the rhythm of the seasons, carrying their stories through memory and song. Health is fragile, dangers are real, but there is also a profound kind of autonomy. If a place turns hostile, you can leave. If a leader abuses power, you can walk away in the night. On the other side is a world that begins to fill with the permanent marks of human presence. Stone houses, storage pits, boundary walls, fields that must be weeded and watered, sacred enclosures like Göbekli Tepe reaching for the sky. Life here offers new forms of security, stored food, denser networks of kinship, places that outlast a single lifetime. It also brings new vulnerabilities, reliance on harvests, rigid hierarchies, conflicts over land, diseases that thrive in crowded settlements. Standing on that threshold, your ancestors couldn't have known what was coming. Cities, kings, writing, empires, taxes, armies, law codes, libraries, philosophies, factories, skyscrapers. They only knew that the old ways were getting harder, the climate less predictable, the gatherings more ambitious, the ties to specific places stronger. They were planting seeds, literally and metaphorically, that would grow into everything we now call civilization. And once those seeds took root, the world of deep time, that world in which humans had lived for more than 95% of our existence, began to fade. Not all at once, not everywhere. Foragers, pastoralists, and mixed societies would continue and still exist today. But the balance was tipping. Fields expanded, villages grew. Stone monuments rose in landscapes that had once known only wind and weather. The long nomadic childhood of our species was coming to an end. The age of settlements, surpluses, and states was about to begin. So now, as the story slows and the night deepens, come back to yourself for a moment, to your breath, to the weight of your body right where you are, resting. This body you live in is not a modern invention. It is a survival machine, fine-tuned across those 100,000 hidden years. Your hands are Stone Age hands, made to shape tools, carry firewood, cradle infants, scrape hides, braid fibers, and gesture while you speak. Your eyes are hunter-gatherer eyes. They notice movement at the edge of vision. They look for pathways, for faces, for the flicker of a fire. Your nervous system is still expecting a world of small bands and open horizons, not traffic lights and notification chimes. Even your emotions are ancient. The warmth you feel with close friends, that is the echo of bandmates huddled around a fire, sharing meat and stories after a dangerous hunt. The anxiety you feel when you are left out or ignored, that is the alarm bell of an ancient brain that knows exile once meant death. The strange comfort of repetitive tasks, stirring a pot, knitting, tidying a room, is the memory of countless hours spent harvesting seeds, grinding grain, knapping stone, doing the small, careful things that kept people alive. Civilization sits on top of all this, like a thin coat of fresh paint. Cities, money, screens, schedules. These are the experiments. Farming, writing, kingdoms and corporations, algorithmic feeds, and electric light. All of it is compressed into the last tiny fraction of our timeline. For well over 90% of our species' existence, none of this was here. No skyscrapers, no empires, no office hours. Just small groups of humans walking across grand landscapes, adapting to the seasons, looking up at the sky. That is the humbling part. We tend to treat our modern world as if it were the default, the destination evolution was aiming for. But from the perspective of deep time, this is the weird, exceptional thing. The bizarre novelty we are still trying to learn how to live with. The true baseline of human life is a campfire under unknown stars. The hum of night insects, the crackle of embers, the sound of someone's voice telling a story. That might be the deepest connection between you and those long-gone ancestors, the stories. For hundreds of thousands of years before writing, before cities, the night was the great theater of the human mind. Imagine those countless prehistoric nights, people lying on their backs, looking up at a sky with no light pollution, every star sharp and brilliant, listening to the wind move through the grass, the calls of distant animals, the quiet breathing of sleeping children. What did they dream about? What tales did they invent to explain the changing face of the moon or the patterns of the constellations? What kind of lullaby did they sing? What joke did they tell? What whispered fear did they share when someone woke suddenly from a nightmare? We will never know the exact words, but the need behind them remains. The urge to weave meaning out of the dark that is still with you. Every time you drift off to sleep, imagining other lives, other worlds. You are doing something very ancient. So as you lie there, listening, maybe in a city apartment, a small town bedroom, or a dorm room far from home, remember that you are not separate from this deep past. You are the latest chapter in an unbroken chain of survivors. Every ancestor, from the bands squeezing through bottlenecks on a hostile planet, to the Ice Age hunters tracking mammoths across frozen plains, managed to live long enough and get lucky enough for the story to reach you. If you enjoyed this journey into deep time, and it helped you fall asleep or just feel a little more connected to the human story, you can show it gently. Tap the like button if you want more explorations like this one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next quiet voyage into the past. And when you have a moment, let us know in the comments where you are listening from. A bedside in London, a night shift break room in Manila, a farmhouse in Canada, a student hostel in Kenya. Seeing those places appear is a bit like watching ancient trade routes light up on a map. Tiny points of fire scattered across the globe, all connected by shared stories. If you'd like to go a step further and support this channel, there is also an optional membership right here on YouTube. It helps us keep making these long, carefully researched, sleep-friendly stories. But that is entirely up to you. Just listening, just being here, already makes you a part of this little community. For now, you don't need to do anything at all. Let your thoughts slow down. Let the noise of the day fade away. Somewhere behind you stand 1,000,000 generations, carrying fire, carrying tools, carrying songs. Tonight, you carry their silence. As you drift towards sleep, remember that you are not alone in time. You are the living edge of a very old story. And that story is still being written with every breath you take.